Hello, and thank you for choosing this heartfelt, clean, historical Western romance by Shelfie Bennett. Before we dive in, please remember to subscribe. Your support helps us continue sharing these wonderful stories with you for free. So find a comfortable spot, relax, and let this tale transport you to another time and place. Enjoy. Chapter 1. The Heiress arrives. The heat hit me first, hot and relentless, settling over the single dirt road that made the town's main street. I shaded my eyes and scanned the row of dust as they hit the town's main street. I shaded the signs. General store, saloon, blacksmith, hung slightly askew, their paint faded and cracked from too many sun-blistered afternoons. Horses clopped past lazily, their tails swishing away flies. It couldn't have been more different from the gleaming white columns of home, where carefully tended gardens unfurled like velvet carpets beneath my bedroom window. The stage driver tossed my bag down from the roof and I grabbed it before it hit the ground. A plain little thing, barely big enough to carry a few dresses, a pair of sturdy shoes, and the 2 books I hadn't been able to leave behind. As the coach driver shouted to his horses and the rig groaned back into motion, I stood there for a moment, clutching the bag in one hand and the brim of my sun hat in the other. I watched the stagecoach rumble away until it disappeared into the heat haze on the horizon. For a fleeting second, a surge of panic welled up in my chest. It would have been easy to chase after it, call for it to stop, climb back inside and let it carry me home. Home. The word felt bitter in my mouth. I shifted my grip on the bag, feeling the weight of my father's letter crumpled in my pocket. "Return at once, or you will lose everything," the letter said. A warning, a threat. All those pretty dresses, the glittering parties, the carriage rides under the gaslights. I could picture them slipping through my fingers. I'd made my choice. I'd left that life behind. I took a deep breath, lifted my chin and squared my shoulders. I wasn't here to run away. I was here to begin again. The stagecoach disappeared into the shimmering heat, and I stood in the middle of the street, already regretting my heavy skirts. Sweat pricked at the nape of my neck as I adjusted my hat, trying to look like I belonged. A few passers-by, men in wide-brimmed hats, women in simple calico dresses, glanced my way, more curious than unkind. I caught snippets of a piano playing in the saloon, the clink of bottles behind the batwing doors. Somewhere farther down the street, a hammer rang out steadily from the blacksmith's forge. And then I saw him. He was leaning against the rail outside the general store, arms crossed over his chest. He had the look of a man who spent his days under the sun, skin-kissed golden, hair dark and unruly beneath a dusty hat. His boots looked as though they'd been places, and the way he stood there, relaxed but alert, made me think he wasn't a man easily startled. He turned his head slightly, his gaze brushing over me like a warm wind. It wasn't the kind of look that lingered or ogled. It was more as if he was sizing me up, weighing whether I might be trouble. It lasted barely a second, but it was enough to make me fidget with my bag and wish I'd worn something that didn't scream newcomer. Then, just as casually, he tipped his hat. No smile, no nod. Just a brief tilt of the brim, and he turned away, boots crunching on the dirt as he strolled toward the saloon. I felt a flicker of irritation. No hello? No welcome to town? What kind of man didn't bother with the basic decency of a greeting? I lifted my chin and muttered under my breath, "Well, aren't you just the picture of hospitality?" But even as I huffed, I caught myself watching the way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt, the way the sunlight glanced off the edge of his jaw. I turned on my heel, forcing my attention back to the general store's porch. I wasn't here to notice rugged ranchers with a lack of manners. I was here for a new start. And that was that. The lantern over the general store's porch swung gently in the evening breeze, casting flickering shadows across the dusty wooden steps. The streets were quiet now, the shops long shuttered, and most of Silver Creek's residents tucked away in their homes. The borrowed book was tucked snugly under my arm, and some sort of historical tome I'd promised to return promptly, when the clatter of hoofbeats jolted me to a stop. I turned in time to see a shadowy figure galloping away from the outskirts of town. The rider was fast, sure, and oddly quiet given the pace. The moonlight caught a silver revolver at his hip as he disappeared into the open plains, and I felt the strangest chill race down my spine. It wasn't the first time I'd heard of someone slipping out under the cover of darkness. In fact, the townsfolk had whispered plenty of tales about a lone vigilante. Some called him a troublemaker, others a necessary evil. But until now, I'd thought of those whispers as just that, stories told to fill the silence around the evening fires. Could it be Gideon? The thought formed before I could stop it. I didn't know much about the rancher. He was a man of few words and fewer smiles, but something about him hinted at a life more complicated than raising cattle. And now, as I stood in the shadows of the general store, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just glimpsed something more. I should have gone home. Any sensible person would have, but my feet didn't quite obey. Instead, they carried me in the direction of the rider. The cool night air nipped at my cheeks and my heartbeat quickened. Not just from the exertion, but from something more. A thrill, almost. This was so unlike me, sneaking around at night, chasing shadows. I clutched the book tighter, as if it might somehow ground me, and picked my way along the edge of the road. I stayed far enough back that I doubted I'd be seen, but close enough to follow. As I moved farther from town, the distant sounds of crickets and the rustle of dry grass replaced the familiar hum of civilization. I knew it was foolish, knew I should turn back, but curiosity pulled me forward, step by step, into the unknown. My boots crunched softly over the brittle grass as I followed the trail, the faint sound of the horse's gallop still fading into the night. The moon hung high and bright, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the rolling terrain. After what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes, I spotted the faint outline of a building ahead. A barn, to be exact. It stood sturdy and solitary against the expanse, its weathered timbers barely visible in the moonlight. The rider slowed, and I slipped behind the nearest cover, a massive oak tree that had probably seen more sunsets than I ever would. The bark was rough against my fingertips as I peered out from behind the twisted trunk. I could feel my pulse drumming in my ears, every beat louder than the last. He dismounted, the horse's hooves crunching softly as it pawed the ground. The man reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a lantern, his movements deliberate and almost practiced. He raised the lantern high, casting a warm glow that cut through the darkness. For a moment, just a heartbeat. His face came into focus. Gideon! There was no mistaking him. That square jaw, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the edges beneath his hat, the steady determination in his gaze. He looked different, though. Not like the quiet, brooding rancher I'd seen in town. There was an intensity to him now, a purpose that sent a shiver down my spine. He disappeared into the barn, the lantern's light fading as he went inside. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Gideon Hayes. The man who barely acknowledged me in town. The man who could cut down a conversation with a single glance. The man who now, apparently, spent his nights sneaking off to secret barns in the middle of nowhere. What was he hiding? And why was it suddenly so hard to turn away? I waited a few more minutes, watching the barn as though it might reveal its secrets, but the door remained closed and the windows dark. There was nothing more I could learn by standing there. My curiosity was already gnawing at me, a relentless little tug in my chest. But I forced myself to turn back. As I walked away, the town lights barely visible in the far distance, my mind raced. Gideon. A vigilante? A thief? Something else entirely? I didn't know. I couldn't know. But one thing was certain. I'd never look at him the same way again. Chapter 2. The town hall smelled of wood polish and old paper, a familiar blend that had begun to feel almost comforting. I sat quietly near the back, trying to focus on the minutes being read aloud, but my eyes kept drifting across the room. To him. Gideon Hayes stood tall, his hat in his hands as he addressed the gathered townsfolk. He wasn't flashy about it. No raised voice. No dramatic gestures, just that low, steady rumble of a voice that somehow made everyone sit up a little straighter. His words were measured, clear, and practical as he explained the boundaries of his property and the reasons why his neighboring rancher's claims didn't hold water. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. No one interrupted him. No one doubted him. Not really. I wasn't sure what fascinated me more, his calm authority or the faint tension in his posture, the way his shoulders held just the smallest hint of strain, as though he carried something far heavier than cattle disputes, or the way his jaw set just a touch too tight, like he was holding back something he couldn't afford to let slip. It made him seem more human than he'd ever allowed himself to be around me, and I couldn't stop watching. When the meeting adjourned, the townsfolk shuffled out in clusters, voices blending into a low hum of gossip and debate. I lingered, pretending to adjust my shawl, my gaze flicking up occasionally to find Gideon still standing near the front. He caught me looking and started toward me. My stomach flipped, once, then twice. "You've got a habit of turning up where you don't belong," he said, his voice quiet but firm. When he reached me. No greeting, just straight to the point. Typical. "Excuse me?" I shot back, my brows lifting. "If anyone here doesn't belong, it's the man sneaking off to secret barns under the cover of night." The words tumbled out before I could think better of them, and I watched his mouth tighten. His eyes, dark, sharp, assessing, seemed to weigh every inch of me. I tried not to fidget, keeping my chin lifted, but it felt like holding my ground against a storm. "You shouldn't have followed me," he said flatly. "It was foolish." "Foolish?" I snapped. "You're the one who—" I caught myself, glancing around. The room was empty now, save for the two of us. Still, my voice lowered. "You're the one who's been skulking around like an outlaw. Don't tell me you weren't expecting questions. You don't know what you're talking about." "Maybe not," I admitted, leaning a little closer. "But that's what happens when someone doesn't bother to explain themselves." He took a step closer than I expected, and I felt the air shift between us. His presence was solid, warm, and far too distracting. His gaze pinned me in place. But I didn't back down. If anything, the stubborn tilt of his jaw made me want to press harder. "It's none of your business," he said, his voice still low, though there was something raw behind it. Not anger, something more. "It is when you start dragging this town's good name through the dust," I countered. "You think no one talks? I've heard the whispers." "So that's it," he said, his lips curving ever so slightly. Not quite a smile, more like a shadow of amusement. "You're worried about the town's reputation." "I'm worried about people I care about getting caught up in something dangerous," I shot back. "And whether you like it or not, you're part of this town too." He didn't respond right away, and the silence stretched just long enough to make my heart thud in my chest. I thought for a moment he might turn and leave, or that he'd brush me off with some dismissive remark. But instead he simply looked at me, long enough that I felt my cheeks grow warm under his steady, unreadable gaze. "I don't have time for this," he said finally, though his voice had softened, and then without another word he walked away, leaving me standing there alone, my thoughts whirling as fast as my pulse. His words stung before they even fully registered. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice a low murmur that made it sound more like a statement of fact than a judgment. He wasn't shouting, but his tone was certain, unyielding, like the ground beneath my feet. He leaned in slightly, his eyes dark and steady, and suddenly I felt the weight of his gaze not just on me, but through me. "What?" I managed to get out, my throat tightening with disbelief. "This town's not for people like you." His words dropped between us like stones, leaving no room for misunderstanding. A flush of heat climbed my neck, a mix of indignation and frustration. "And what kind of people is that, exactly?" I shot back, my hands clenching at my sides. I straightened my posture, unwilling to let him see just how deeply his words had struck. My tone was sharp, my words firing back before I could think twice. He held my gaze, his eyes narrowing just slightly, as if he were weighing my reaction. The air between us grew heavier, taut, like a rope stretched to its limit. I could see the muscle in his jaw tighten, the flicker of something unresolved in his expression. But he didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked away, his boots crunching against the dirt floor as he left me standing there. For a moment I just stood there, my fists still clenched, my chest tight with unspoken retorts. My thoughts swirled, colliding between disbelief, irritation, and something I couldn't quite place. I watched his broad shoulders retreat into the shadows, his figure growing smaller with each step, but that tension, that lingering charge, didn't fade. I wanted to call after him, to demand an answer, to force him to explain what he really meant, but I didn't. I stood in place, my heart thudding, my mind spinning, and when he finally disappeared from sight, I was left staring at the empty space he'd left behind, my hands slowly unclenching as my emotions settled into a simmer. Chapter 3. The morning started as usual. Children's laughter bounced off the schoolhouse walls, their chalky fingers raising clouds of white dust as they practiced their sums. The faint, familiar creak of the blackboard hung in the background. Then came the distant rumble of hooves, faint at first, like a bad dream waiting to break through. I thought nothing of it until shouting followed, sharp, ragged. A gunshot cracked the quiet air. I froze, the piece of chalk in my hand tumbling to the floor. The children turned to me, wide-eyed and motionless, their little faces drained of colour. My heart beat so fast I thought they'd hear it over the rising commotion outside. "Everyone, get inside," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. The schoolhouse door groaned as I slammed it shut and threw the lock. "Under the desks," I said firmly. "Don't move until I say." Little feet shuffled, the children darting to the corners and crouching beneath the benches. I grabbed the broomstick, the first thing my hands found, and wedged it against the doorknob for good measure. The distant thud of horses' hooves grew louder, mingling with the frantic shouts from down the street. Another gunshot shattered the stillness, followed by the splintering crash of wood. Somewhere near the bank, I guessed. The schoolhouse, so full of lively chatter just moments ago, now sat heavy with silence. The smell of gunpowder drifted in through the gaps in the windows, mixing with the dry, dusty heat of the day. Sweat gathered on my temples, trickling down the back of my neck. I pressed my palm against the door, half expecting it to give way under the force of my heartbeat alone. Every muffled scream and crack of a pistol made the children flinch. I whispered reassurances, even as my throat tightened around words I didn't quite believe myself. A loud crash outside the schoolyard made my grip on the broomstick tighten. My mind raced through every story I'd heard about these outlaws, rough men who didn't think twice about harming those who got in their way. I counted the seconds between gunshots, each one a little closer. I whispered a quick prayer. Then, just when the crashing grew louder, when I could feel the heat of the danger just beyond the wooden walls, it happened. Gideon's voice cut through the chaos like a crack of thunder. I couldn't hear every word, but the sharp, commanding tone was unmistakable. It wasn't a question, not a plea, it was an order. A few more shots fired, louder now, but they weren't coming closer. They were scattered, flanked. I dared to look out the small window and caught sight of him, Gideon Hayes, rifle in hand, shouting orders to a few ranch hands who'd flank the outlaws. His hat was tilted low, his face grim but composed. He moved with a quiet, dangerous precision. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter. It wasn't the first time I'd seen him handle himself, but this was different. He wasn't just a rancher now. He was a man taking control of a storm. The outlaws tried to regroup, but the ranchers pressed them back, driving them away from the schoolyard and farther down the street. Gideon's voice barked another command, and the air crackled with final gunshots. Then, silence. I didn't move for what felt like hours. Slowly, I pushed the broomstick away and opened the door a crack. The children stayed huddled as I peeked out. Gideon was there, still, his rifle resting against his leg. His shoulders were rigid, and his face, normally so unreadable, seemed different. Tired, lined, with something heavier than just the fight. For the first time I noticed the faint slump of his stance, as if the weight of what he'd done, and what he had to keep doing, was too much to carry upright. He looked over his shoulder and caught me watching. Our eyes met for just a moment, and then he turned away, the brim of his hat hiding his face as he walked back toward the rest of his men. The schoolhouse was quiet again, though the air still buzzed faintly with the tension of what had just happened. The children sat in small clusters, their faces streaked with dust and the faintest tracks of dried tears. I busied myself with calming them, offering a pat on the shoulder here, a gentle word there, until their nerves settled. But the adrenaline still thrummed through me, a steady, restless beat in my chest. And then I noticed Gideon leaning against the far wall, cradling his arm. Blood seeped through his shirt sleeve, staining the fabric dark. He was trying to hide it, typical, but the set of his jaw and the tightness around his eyes gave him away. "Sit," I said before I even thought about it. He looked up at me, his mouth already open to refuse, but I shot him a glare that cut him off mid-protest. He sighed, low and rumbling, and sank down onto one of the desks, his long legs stretched out in front of him. I grabbed the little tin of bandages I kept in the cabinet. Not for him, of course. I'd never expected to patch up a man who apparently lived by putting himself in harm's way, but for the children's scraped knees and elbows. Yet now I found myself pulling out clean cloth strips and a small jar of salve, silently thanking my own foresight. "Hold still," I said, tugging at his sleeve. He didn't flinch, didn't even move as I tore the fabric away to get to the wound. A graze, messy but not too deep. I poured a bit of water from a basin and pressed a clean cloth to the cut, wincing as he hissed under his breath. "You could warn a man, you know," he muttered. Then I said, "I could," I said with a saccharine smile, "but you'd probably just grumble anyway." He glanced at me, his lips twitching as though fighting a smirk. "You're full of sass for someone who's never held a rifle, and you're full of yourself for someone who just got shot," I countered, pulling the cloth away to inspect the wound. It wasn't nearly as bad as I'd feared. A bit of salve, a firm bandage, he'd be fine. Probably fine enough to ride off into another mess by sundown, if I knew him at all. I worked in silence for a moment, winding the bandage around his arm. His skin was warm under my fingertips, and the faint smell of leather, sweat, and something woodsy clung to him. He was close, closer than we'd ever been before, and for the first time I noticed the little details, the faint line of stubble on his jaw, the way his dark eyes held a quiet intensity. My hands slowed as I tied off the bandage, and when I looked up I found him watching me. His voice softened, the rough edge fading. "Thanks," he said, barely above a whisper. I should have looked away then, gone back to fussing over the children or straightening desks, but I didn't. I met his gaze and held it, searching for something in his eyes that I wasn't sure I could name. The usual gruffness was gone, replaced by something quieter, something that felt raw and unguarded. My chest tightened. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. He broke eye contact, straightened his shoulders, and stood. The moment we'd shared whatever it was slipped between us, unspoken. He adjusted his hat, nodded once, and walked out, leaving me there with a racing heart and the faint scent of him lingering in the room. Chapter 4. The barn smelled of fresh hay and warm horses, the faint scent of leather and saddle oil blending into the night air. The lantern hung low from a wooden beam, its light spilling unevenly over the stalls, over Gideon's tense frame as he leaned against a post. His hat was off, resting on a nearby barrel, and the shadows it left exposed sharp angles to his face that I hadn't noticed before. Or maybe I had, and I'd just pretended not to. I stood in the doorway, the chilly night air at my back, while my fists clenched at my sides. My voice shook, but I didn't care. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded. "Risking your life hiding in the shadows? Don't you see what it's doing to you?" He didn't look at me at first, just stared down at his hands. The knuckles were rough, worn from years of work, from holding reins too tight and a rifle too often. Finally, he glanced up, his expression unreadable, though his jaw tightened. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low, almost tired. "Then make me understand," I snapped, stepping further into the barn. The wooden floor creaked under my boots, but I kept going until I was close enough to feel the tension radiating off him. "Every time you ride out at night, every time you come back with blood on your shirt, I have to wonder if it's the last time. Do you think that's fair?" He straightened, his dark eyes meeting mine at last. "What I do, it's not about fair, Lucy. It's about making things right." "And what about you?" I shot back. "When do you get to stop? When does this end?" His gaze softened for a fraction of a second before hardening again. "It doesn't." That word hung between us, heavy and unyielding. It knocked the wind out of me more than I cared to admit. I took another step closer, lowering my voice. "You can't keep living like this. It's going to tear you apart." "Don't you see that?" He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I don't have the luxury of thinking about myself. Not in this town. Not with the people depending on me." "That's not true," I whispered. "You just don't want to let anyone in." His eyes narrowed, but he didn't reply. The lantern's light flickered, casting uneven shadows that danced across his face. I held my ground, trying to keep my voice steady even as my heart raced. "You don't have to carry all of this alone," I said, softer now. "You don't have to keep shutting everyone out." Gideon ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping just a little. He looked like he wanted to say something, like the words were right there on the tip of his tongue, but instead he turned his back to me, grabbed a hat from the barrel and shoved it back onto his head. "Go home, Lucy," he said over his shoulder. His voice rough, his tone final. "This isn't your fight." I stayed where I was, watching as he walked to the barn door. My chest ached, but I refused to let it show. "If you won't tell me the truth," I called after him, "then don't expect me to stay out of it." He paused, his hand resting on the barn door frame. For a moment I thought he might turn around, that he might give me some kind of answer, but he didn't. The door creaked as it swung open, and he stepped out into the night without another word, leaving me in the glow of the lantern, surrounded by hay and silence. His words hit me like the crack of a whip, sharp and unexpected. "You think I want this?" he snapped, his voice low and rough enough to raise the hair on the back of my neck. Gideon stepped forward, his eyes blazing like a storm over the prairie. "You think I enjoy riding out every night, risking everything? I'm not the man you think I am. I'm not the hero in your story, Lucy." For a moment his words left me breathless. They hung in the air between us, heavy and bitter. It would have been easier, so much easier, to back down, to lower my gaze, to let him be. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I straightened my shoulders, my pulse pounding against my ribs. "Then what are you?" I shot back, my voice steadier than I felt. "A man who hides behind a mask? Who pushes everyone away because he's too scared to let them see who he really is?" His jaw tightened, his hands flexing at his sides. The light from the lantern danced across his face, revealing the fine lines of weariness etched there. But even as his anger simmered, I saw something deeper, something vulnerable, something raw. I saw a man who'd been carrying the weight of the world for so long he didn't remember how to put it down. "You can call yourself whatever you want," I said, taking a step closer. "But I see you, Gideon. I see a man who's trying to do what's right, even if it costs him. A man who doesn't realize how much he has to offer, if only he'd stop shutting everyone out." His breath hitched, barely noticeable, but I caught it. His shoulders stiffened as if bracing for a blow, but his gaze held mine, fierce and unyielding. The moment stretched long and taut, the air between us crackling like a summer storm. "You don't know me," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "Maybe not everything," I admitted, my tone softening. "But I know enough. I know you're not as broken as you think you are." His defenses faltered, just for a heartbeat. I saw the flicker in his eyes, the crack in his armor. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell me that beneath all that anger, all that stubborn pride, there was a man worth fighting for. Gideon's voice dropped to a rough, quiet rasp as he stepped closer. His dark eyes bore into mine, intense enough to pin me in place. "You don't know what I've done," he said, low and strained. "What I've had to do." I didn't flinch. My heart hammered, but I held his gaze. I could see the storm swirling behind those eyes, the secrets and regrets he carried like old wounds that never healed. His closeness made the air feel heavier, charged with something I couldn't put into words. The faint, familiar scent of leather and wood smoke clung to him, and it only seemed to pull me further in. "I know what you can be," I whispered, barely more than a breath. I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence that followed, the chirp of distant crickets weaving through the tension. He was so close now that I could see the faint line of stubble on his jaw, the way his shoulders rose and fell with each heavy breath. For a moment, it felt like the whole world narrowed down to just this, just us. His eyes searched mine, as if trying to find something that might convince him, something that might change his mind, but whatever he was looking for, he didn't find it. He turned away abruptly, his shoulders stiff, the brim of his hat shading his face as he took a step back. The space he put between us was like a snap of cold air after a summer storm. He walked away without another word, leaving the barn door swinging gently in his wake. I stood there, still feeling the heat of his presence, still feeling the words I hadn't said caught somewhere in my throat. And when the cricket's song returned to fill the silence, it was louder than ever. Chapter 5. The air was sharp with tension, and the scent of gunpowder hung in the wind. The Baron's hired men spread out in a rough semicircle, their horses kicking up plumes of dust as they closed in on us. My fingers tightened around the reins of my mare, the leather slick in my grasp. Gideon sat stiffly in the saddle beside me, his rifle resting on his knee, his jaw clenched. The fading sunlight painted the scene in a dusky red hue, as if the land itself was bleeding. "You should have stayed out of this," Gideon muttered, his voice low and tight. "And you face them alone?" I shot back. My pulse raced, but I kept my tone steady. "Not a chance!" Before he could respond, the hired guns surged forward, shouting threats. The sharp report of a rifle cracked through the air, and Gideon jerked to the side. He managed to stay upright, but I saw his hand fly to his arm, blood seeping through his sleeve. I gasped, the sound more a hiss of breath than anything, and turned to him. "You're hit!" I exclaimed. "Stay focused, Lucy," he barked, his face pale but his voice steady. "They're still coming." But his wound shifted something inside me. That flash of red on his sleeve was all I needed to spur me into action. My heart was pounding, but my mind sharpened. I scanned the ranch, taking in the stacks of hay bales, the small paddock to the left, and the slope of the hill behind the barn. The terrain was more than just home, it was a weapon. I grabbed the attention of one of the ranch hands, a wiry man named Hank, who'd been lingering near the fence line. "Hank!" I called out, gesturing wildly. "Get the others to circle back toward the barn. Use the hay bales as cover. Move now!" Hank nodded and bolted, shouting orders as he went. A handful of ranchers, armed with whatever they could find, pitchforks, shotguns, even a broken fence post, rushed to set up a makeshift defense. My pulse thrummed in my ears as I climbed down from my mare, crouching behind a stack of barrels. I felt the bite of fear clawing at me, but I refused to give it ground. Gideon was hurt, and these men weren't going to stop unless we made them. The ranch hands sprang into action, weaving between the barns and corrals. Hank's men blocked the attacker's advance, while I shouted directions, urging everyone to hold their ground. The Baron's men hesitated when they saw the resistance, their charge faltering. It wasn't just Gideon standing against them now, it was a whole community, galvanized by the sight of their leader, wounded but unbowed. Gideon's voice cut through the chaos, rough and commanding. "Push 'em back! Don't give an inch!" I glanced his way and saw him, pale but resolute, shouting orders even as blood streaked his arm. There was something unshakable about him in that moment, a man fighting not just for his land but for all of us. His courage was infectious. I couldn't help the small surge of pride and something else that twisted in my chest, something warmer, fiercer. The Baron's hired men, clearly unused to such resistance, began to scatter. A few turned and rode off into the gathering twilight, the rest following in disorganized retreat. Gideon's men, no, our men, chased them to the edge of the ranch before pulling back, their shouts ringing with triumph. As the dust settled and the last of the riders vanished into the horizon, I sank to my knees behind the barrels, my hands trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. The town was still, the only sound the distant whinny of a horse and the murmurs of the ranch hands checking in with one another. Gideon sat in his saddle, watching the retreating figures. Even from this distance, I could see the wariness in his posture, the weight he carried, but his chin was high, his gaze steady. and for the first time I saw not just the man he thought he had to be, but the one he truly was. Stubborn, strong, and just maybe something more. I kept my hand firmly under Gideon's good arm, practically dragging him up the ranch house steps. He grumbled the whole way, of course. "Lucy, I can walk," he muttered through gritted teeth. "And I can cook," I said. "But we both know some things are better left to someone more qualified." That earned me a sharp glance. "I don't recall you ever offering to cook." I smiled sweetly. "Exactly." When I pushed open the door, he hesitated on the threshold. Maybe it was the pain in his arm, maybe it was just his pride, but for a second he looked like a man facing a firing squad instead of a warm, safe house. I didn't give him the chance to argue, though. I nudged him inside, guiding him toward the chair by the hearth. "Sit! Stay! Don't argue," I said, pointing him into the seat. He scowled, but the moment he eased himself down, his shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. I went straight to the cupboard for bandages, salve, and water, moving as fast as I could. The tension from the battle still hung heavy in the air, and every so often the image of Gideon falling off his horse flashed in my mind, sending a chill through me. When I finally knelt by his chair, the faint flicker of the hearth cast soft light over his face. He looked older in that moment, lines of pain and exhaustion creasing his features. His shirt was torn, the fabric darkened by blood at the sleeve. I worked carefully, soaking a cloth and pressing it to the wound, trying not to think about how close this had come to ending so much worse. "You've got a knack for bossing people around," he muttered as I tied off the bandage. "And you've got a knack for ignoring your own limits," I shot back, though my voice softened as I spoke. "If you think I'm going to let you bleed out just to protect that pride of yours, you're wrong." He met my eyes then, something unspoken passing between us. His hand brushed mine, a fleeting touch, and I swore I could feel the heat of it all the way up my arm. For a long moment we sat there in silence, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire and our breaths mingling in the quiet. I wanted to say something, anything, but I couldn't find the words. His gaze dropped, and he leaned back, breaking the spell. "Thank you," he said, so low I almost missed it. I nodded, my throat too tight to respond, and turned to tidy the bandages instead. The next day the town began picking up the pieces. I saw it when I went to fetch supplies at the general store. The saloon's shattered window was being replaced, the schoolhouse roof had a patch of new shingles, and the streets, though still dusty, had an air of renewed purpose. People greeted each other warmly, exchanging smiles instead of wary glances. It wasn't just the buildings being fixed. It was something deeper. The spirit of the place felt lighter, stronger. When I stepped inside the store, the owner gave me a broad smile. "Never thought I'd say it, but I owe that rancher of yours a drink. Might even make it a double." "Not my rancher," I said automatically, though the warmth in my cheeks said otherwise. He just chuckled. "Well, whatever he is, you tell him thanks. Add yourself too. We'll be stronger after this, I reckon." Outside I noticed folks stopping to talk to Gideon. He stood tall, the sun catching on his hat's brim, and even though his arm was still in a sling, his presence seemed to set people at ease. He nodded here, tipped his hat there, and when his gaze met mine, something softened in his expression. I quickly busied myself adjusting my shawl, trying not to let on how much that look unsettled me. In all the wrong and right ways. By the end of the week, the Baron packed up what little power he had left and left town. I heard it from one of the ranch hands who came by with a knowing grin. "The big man's hightailing it," he said. "Guess he figured he couldn't scare us any more." That night, Gideon and I stood by the paddock, watching the last of the sunlight fade behind the hills. The sky blazed pink and orange, like a promise of something better to come. He leaned against the fence, his good hand resting on the rail, and I kept my arms crossed, half to keep the chill off, half to keep my nerves in check. "It's over, then," I said, breaking the silence. "For now," he replied, his voice low and thoughtful. "But it doesn't mean there won't be more trouble down the line." "Maybe," I said softly, "but at least we know what we're capable of, together." He turned to look at me, the faintest smile ghosting across his lips. "Guess I underestimated you." "Only took you a few life-threatening situations to figure that out," I said lightly. though my heart skipped at the warmth in his tone. We stood there as the colours faded from the sky, a comfortable silence stretching between us. For once I didn't feel the need to fill it. There was something solid, something sure in that moment. It wasn't perfect, not by any means, but it was real. Chapter 6. I know about the nights, the secrets. I know you've been putting yourself in danger for the sake of this town. He didn't move at first, just tipped his head forward as if the weight of the words had landed squarely on his shoulders. Then he turned slowly and met my gaze. His eyes were dark, shadowed by something I couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe, or weariness. "Then you know more than most," he said quietly. "But you don't know everything." I crossed my arms, leaning back against the barn door. "Then tell me," I said. "Tell me why you've been pushing me away, why you've taken all of this on yourself. If you think I can't handle it, you're wrong." He stepped closer, just enough that the lantern's light caught the edge of his face. "It's not about you handling it, Lucy. It's about what I've done, the things I can't take back." His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "There were times I made the wrong choices. Times I thought I was doing the right thing, only to find out it wasn't. And then there were times I knew I was doing wrong, but I did it anyway because it seemed like the only way out. That's why I ride out at night, why I keep my distance. Because if anyone got close, if you got close, you'd see what I really am." My chest tightened. "What you are," I said softly, "is someone who cares. Someone who's been fighting to protect the people around you, even when it costs you. You're not perfect, Gideon, but that doesn't make you unworthy." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "You're wrong. It makes me dangerous." "You think I don't know what dangerous looks like?" I shot back. "I've lived my whole life under a different kind of danger, of being told who to be, how to act, how to fit into a world I never wanted. I've fought to be here, to stay here, and I'm not going to let you push me away because you think you're doing me some kind of favor." His eyes locked onto mine, and for a long, quiet moment neither of us moved. The tension between us was as thick as the dust motes hanging in the warm barn air. Finally he let out a long, slow breath and turned back to the stall where his saddle hung. He reached up and unhooked it, letting it drop to the floor with a heavy thud. Then he removed his hat, setting it on the rail. "I've spent so long trying to be two different people," he said, almost to himself, "if that can protect this town and one that can live in it. But I can't keep doing both." He glanced at me over his shoulder. "If I'm going to stay, I need to be honest. With them and with you." I stepped closer until I was standing beside him. I reached out, my fingers brushing his arm lightly. "You don't have to do it alone," I said. "We've all made mistakes. But if you let people in, if you let me in, you'll see that you're not as far gone as you think." He met my gaze, his expression softening. There was something vulnerable in his eyes that I hadn't seen before, something that made my throat tighten. Slowly he nodded. "And no more masks," he said, his voice low but steady. "No more secrets." And in that moment, the weight he carried seemed to shift. Just a little, as if he was finally letting someone else help hold it. The morning sun was warm but soft, casting a golden glow over the ranch as I stepped outside. The sky stretched wide and blue above, with just a few wisps of cloud drifting lazily along the horizon. The air smelled fresh, carrying hints of wild flowers and clean hay, and the faint sound of hammering echoed from the paddock. I could see Gideon and a couple of the ranch hands working on the fence line, the wooden posts lined up neatly like soldiers standing at attention. For once, Gideon wasn't barking orders or stalking off on his own. Instead, he was in the thick of things, hammer in hand, laughing quietly at something one of the men said. The sight made me pause. He wasn't just the stoic rancher anymore. He was part of the community now, a man with friends at his side and purpose in his movements. The warmth in my chest wasn't from the sun alone. By the schoolyard, the children were already running around, their laughter tumbling through the air like birdsong. I had spread a long blanket over the grass and set out books, slates, and a jar of fresh pencils, thinking today would be best spent under the open sky. They darted between the rows of wildflowers, giggling as they tried to catch one another. For the first time in weeks, their carefree energy felt real, not forced. As the schoolhouse stood tall in the background, its roof repaired, its windows sparkling in the sunlight, seeing it whole again was like seeing a part of myself restored. When I called the children back to the blanket, they came tumbling in like a wave, faces flushed, eyes bright. I passed out slates and smiled as they set to work, still chattering about the flowers and the dragonflies they'd chased. It wasn't just a lesson today. It was a reminder of what we'd all fought for, a place to learn, to grow, to hope. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, I wandered toward the gate that marked the edge of the property. There was a gentle hum of crickets in the grass, the first whispers of evening rising around me. I didn't expect to find Gideon there, but when I rounded the corner, there he was. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his hands resting lightly on the gate, and his gaze turned toward the horizon. He must have heard my footsteps, because he glanced over his shoulder, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I stopped a few steps away, hesitating. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then I stepped closer, and he turned to face me fully. When my hand brushed his, I felt the faint, rough texture of calluses against my fingers. His touch lingered just a second longer than I expected. I met his eyes, and whatever words I'd been thinking of saying melted away. There was no need. I could see it in the way he looked at me, steady and sure. I could feel it in the warmth of his hand, the quiet strength in the way he didn't pull away. We turned together, our steps unhurried as we started back toward the house. The land stretched wide around us, rich and solid, and for the first time in a long while it felt like home. Not just for him, not just for me, but for us.